I must say it's a wonderful privilege for me to be here and have opportunity of joining in this really exciting conference. I have had the privilege of knowing Provost Minor just only a short while ago, as he mentioned, and I was very touched by his kindness. And I'm very happy that so many people take an interest in this subject. This has been a subject I've tried to work on for many years, as the Provost kindly mentioned. But aside from celebrating it and saluting it, I also have a somewhat subversive point to make, namely that it's very important to emphasize the social determinants of health, but I'm more ambitious, more imperialist in this. I think even the contrast between the medical care and social determinants may be a difficult line to draw. And I would like to argue, and you will see at my time, I've given 45 minutes, but I'm trying to do it in 30 or 35 so that we get Q&A, trying to argue that, in fact, the medical care is part of the social determinants of health as well. And those numbers may be a little deceptive because medical care may affect life and death in a smaller proportion of cases, but they're much more easier to manipulate immediately and quickly. That doesn't mean we should slacken our efforts on social determinants, but it does mean that we have to weigh each of them in terms of the extent to which we can influence them and change the world. However, all this is going to come, I hope, in the text. But I don't begin, however, with medicine. I begin with poetry. In a moving poem called To Virgil, Alfred Tennyson salutes the great Latin poet Virgil, born in Mantua or Mantova in the 1st century BC. I salute thee, Montevano, says Tennyson, I that loved thee since my day began, unquote. That admiration for Virgil was surely well deserved. But what does the word salute mean? Of course, we all tend to know what it means, at least at one level. As the Webster's New World Dictionary puts it prettily, to salute means to honor by performing a prescribed act, such as raising the hand to the head. There's no difficulty in following the communication there. The gesture of saluting are omnipresent across the world, though the forms differ, as the hundreds of books and articles written on the divergent traditions in saluting bring out, showing on one hand the differences between various military and civilian usages, and also the way the saluting differs between different cultures. I was quite struck to see between the Zogist salute of the erstwhile Royal Albanian Army to the clenched fist salute of the Black Power movement, the variety of the form in which salute can take place. While there's no mystery in the widespread use of saluting as a gesture, there's something a little intriguing in the choice of the word that has come to represent this kind of greeting. What does the word salute mean? The word salute is derived from the Latin for health. And this dual connection is present even today in English usage. Salutation is an act of greeting, while salutary still stands for something being helpful or beneficial, and salubrious definitely means simply helpful, as the Webster Dictionary points out. The question that arises here is this: what does the choice of the idea of health in the dominant form of human greeting indicate? At one level, it certainly reflects the fact that we tend to take health to be, in general, the most immediately important aspect of a person. The recognition of the centrality of health is an understandable acknowledgement. Of course, this can become excessive. The preoccupation with health can vary from culture to culture, and I have to confess, in my own culture, Bengali culture, there's a kind of obsession there, and so much obsession that it tends to amaze other people elsewhere, in fact, even within the Indian subcontinent. I remember my colleague, dear colleague, dead alas now, Khalek Naqvi, with whom I taught in Delhi University, who came from the more austere northern culture of Lucknow, he used to tell me that he could never get over the fact that a normal conversation of greeting between two Bengalis went something like this, one asking, "So happy to see you, how is your kidney?" To which he could receive such replies as, "Oh, my kidney is fine for the moment. How is yours?" Middle-class Bengalis may be a little crazy on the subject of health, but there is a general understanding across the world that health is arguably not only the most important aspect of our lives, but it is also a distinctly social object. While a natural role in communication, with a natural role in communication, discussion, learning, and understanding, and frequently, I fear, misunderstanding. The pervasive engagement of the human mind on the subject of health can hardly fail to have an effect. It can, of course, also have a negative effect, with terrible practices being affirmed, reaffirmed, and reaffirmed. But it could also have a very positive effect, and the role of education, which is one of the subjects which will be discussed here under the social determinants of health, and informed public discussion can make a major difference, including the role that the media can play on this subject. A point that was noted in 18th century already by Mary Wollstonecraft. Analysis of the social determinants of health, the subject of our discussion in this wonderfully promising meeting, has to take adequate note of these far-reaching relationships. There are, of course, a number of specific statistical connections that link health and society, as will indeed be discussed in the papers to be presented in this meeting. But underlying these specific connections is the foundational and far-reaching fact, and that's why I began with saluting, that health is quintessentially a social subject. Underlying the motivation for, or behind the motivation for investigating the social determinants of health are both epistemology and practical reason. We want to know what factors determine the health of people, how that determination link with the kind of society we have, what explains the fact that human beings with basically similar biological heritage can end up having such diverse health experiences. The Provost pointed out how much, despite higher expenditure in healthcare in the US, how the average performance is often very low. On top of that, of course, the differences are radical. I mean, having lived in Europe, I know that there are very complicated cases where the first thought that will occur to you is how to go to Hopkins or to Boston to seek medical care. So you could get the finest, and yet on the other end, a phenomenon which would be unknown to me at that time in England, that there would be people who had no medical care at all or hardly any. It's the inequality that is quite dramatic in this context. So the nature of the medical services that are on offer can be extremely important, and that I do want to emphasize, but the determining influences stretch well beyond that immediate linkage. And if the knowledge of these connections is important in itself, epistemology we have to recognize is partly its own reward. We want to know what the social determinants are. The usefulness of this knowledge in enhancing human life and in improving the world around us would be hard to overestimate. Sir Thomas Browne, the distinguished author of a book, Religio Medici or Medici, more than 3.5 centuries ago in 1643, said, "The world is not an inn, but a hospital." Things have progressed since then, and the hospital that is the world is doing quite a bit better over time, reflected, for example, in the fact that life expectancy have radically expanded from bound days, which as near as I can guess was below 30. And yet the prevalence of treatable but untreated ailments across the globe is still shockingly large. Indeed, even on the 11th of September 2011, that fateful day, many times more people died of AIDS alone than from violence on that very day, even after taking account of all the people who were slaughtered by the terrorists in the USA. And on a more normal day, the death toll from preventive or controllable diseases can be many hundred times larger than the tolls from violence. While terrorism may kill thousands, it was estimated about a decade ago, I couldn't get a more later estimate, that more than 20 million deaths per year from treatable illnesses around the world could be prevented by one of those various changes to which Dr. Miner referred. So how can human lives be enhanced and improved even if we do not want to be as obsessive as Thomas Brown in treating the entire world as a hospital? A wide range of policies and actions have powerful influence on our health, and these must be taken into account in evaluating the use of resources for the pursuit of good health. Indeed, in dealing with policy making, it is important to go beyond healthcare facilities into general economic and social arrangements, which can have very important effects on health. Health is influenced not just by healthcare and the use of medicine, but also, for example, by the general economic prosperity and social cohesion, as well as by economic and social inequalities. And this subject has been, the distinction between good health policy and good policy for health has been one of my preoccupations, and indeed I'm very privileged. A number of my students, including Jennifer Ruger, with the book Health and Social Justice, have pursued that, and there's still some people doing right now. My friend Michael Marmot has been very concerned with that, dealing particularly with the question of status, to which also Dr. Miner referred, and how depending on your station in life, your mortality rate could vary, but vary not, as some people think, connected with only income, but also mental considerations, the unfreedom that being in a position on which you are sat upon produces. So freedom and unfreedom has a major impact on mortality. But on top of that, there is a question of medical service too. And if I look at one of my friends, Michael Marmot, on one side, I look also at Paul Farmer and pathologies of power, how inequality can affect the availability of medical care enormously. I might take this opportunity here to salute, if I may use the word again, I don't know how much it's flourishing still, but I remember reading a lot, the really fantastic work that the Hopkins medical student did in Burma in providing backpack medicine. And they were just pure medicine. They were not changing social determinants. But of course, because of the military government hostility to the Kachins and the Karyans, it's very difficult for them to get medical care. And a lot of students from Hopkins actually took the risk of life in going there and providing medical care to these otherwise completely neglected tribal group, ethnic group in Burma. It's a major, in my judgment, a major contribution to international help, and really exemplary. I'm always struck by that. I used to be president of Oxfam for about 3 years. I was, and quite remarkable to see how people are ready to do selflessly various things across the world. Now, I think I don't want to spend too much time on, since I do want time for discussion, on the issues about how the various things could make a difference. The education, the early life care, the presence of violence and non-violence, the inequalities in economic and social life. And these will, of course, receive a lot of attention, and rightly so. But what about medical care? I think the fact is that health is a quintessentially social subject, which is where I began. What we have to bear in mind is that the amount that is spent in medical care and how it's spent, in what form, for whom, in what degree of accessibility and what degree of entitlement that people might have, really makes a dramatic difference. And this is where we have to see the social determinants to include politics as well as economics. Dr. Miner was kind to refer to my work on famine. I think the first famine I studied was, in fact, the first famine that the only famine I actually lived inside, namely the Bengal famine of 43, the last famine in India, 4 years before independence, in which up to 3 million people died. It was made possible, I mean, there was the question of food and distribution, but there was also, I mean, no matter how little or how much food you have, you also need, this was a time to arrange the government to have some kind of relief. You need food in the hands of the government at that time. Well, of course, the government was utterly reluctant to do it. And indeed, they were kind of lulled into a belief that there wasn't a famine going on. The Indian papers were all censored. The English papers took on a voluntary role in not reporting on the famine, while millions were dying around them. And it's only ultimately the protest broke through because of nationalist movement and by a courageous English-owned paper, The Statesman, where the editors, Ian Stevens, whom I came to know much later as a fellow of King's, where he came after tremendous hesitation, decided that he was betraying his profession as a journalist, and stopped that and started producing harrowing reports. I think 16th and 18th of October of 1942 were the great days, and within a week this was being debated in the parliament in Britain. India, of course, had no parliament under the Raj, and within another week, arrangements for relief began, and by the end of the month, the famine was over. So it's really, that is also social determinant. That's also what we agitate for, what we ask for, what we insist. I always tell my students that one of the most neglected thinkers of 18th century European Enlightenment is Mary Wollstonecraft, and no one discusses it so much, so clearly, both in the Vindication of the Rights of Men and her later book on the Rights of Women, about that it's not just the legal engagement, it's also the media, it's also the public discussion, it's also the education, it's also the way you change the dialogue of a country. And these things are inescapably involved in determining not only all the things that we are discussing rightly and importantly under the standard heading of social determinant, but it also goes to non-standard headings, namely about the politics of what we regard as important, what people know. Media information is extraordinarily important. I was just appalled to see how the state of healthcare in the country and what can be provided by National Health Services and standardly did in nearly every country in Europe got so totally distorted in this country that you couldn't emerge out of that the rhetoric that had been generated essentially by ignorance about how the National Health Services operated, not just in Europe, but in Japan, in Korea, in Singapore, Hong Kong, very capitalist countries in the world. It was, I think the battle was lost with the media, and that battle is extraordinarily important. Now, I think the issue of famine prevention is also connected with the media. I've tried to argue that famines do not take place in democracies mainly because of the democracy and the voting and the media, so you can't hide the information about it. And so that is not surprising that famines take place only under authoritarian rules like colonialism, as in British India or Ireland, or one-party states, as in the Soviet Union in the 30s, and in China, with the failure of the Great Leap Forward policy, in which 30 million people died, and in Cambodia later on, and military dictatorship, as in Ethiopia and Somalia, and the contemporary famine situation in North Korea is a continuing example of that. And these are also part of the social determinants of health, involving politics and ultimately economics. Now, I think the difference, however, is this with famines and other things, is the famines are very easy to politicize. And an editor does not need any kind of skill to politicize it. You have to print a picture of an emaciated mother and a skin and bone baby, and you have written an editorial. But India has actually not had a famine since independence, and that's not surprising given that also democracy came within 2 years of independence. At the same time, the intolerableness of quiet, non-extreme hunger, which debilitates people, makes them more prone to illnesses, makes them more difficult to learn things, affects education, and indeed brain development. These have been much harder to politicize. A contrast is often made between India and China, which often comes up in this context, as to that China had often done very well, not always. I mean, at the height of the famine, it wasn't doing well. But you see, the great thing about the authoritarian system is that it's quite easy to change this group thinking. And if they go in that direction, and if they're sympathetic, then you will get a lot of good results. And the Chinese government have been very sympathetic. It's not been like North Korea, like Cambodia, and there's so many, world is full of authoritarian regimes which didn't do anything. So one has to salute China in this respect. And yet, there's a kind of fragility, because it depends on the understanding of the leaders. And if that goes wrong, everything can go wrong too. That went deeply wrong at the time of the Great Leap Forward. 30 million people died, while not a single newspaper carried an editorial attacking it. There was no opposition to it at all. Then there was a period of the Great Leap Forward, gave way to Cultural Revolution. China was politically committed to providing healthcare for everyone. Not a very high-level healthcare, but healthcare for everyone. And you see them in the longevity statistics. They went up from being middle 30s to being about 68. They said 71, but I think 68 is just about the right number, by about 79 when the economic reforms came. Their industries were bad, their agriculture was foul, their healthcare was underdeveloped but covered absolutely everybody. One morning in 79, they all decided that they were going to change it. And this was a dramatically good thing for agriculture and industry, which started booming. The Chinese economy is growing faster than any other country has ever grown in the past. But in that period, having moved from being totally anti-market to being totally pro-market, the Chinese decided also to abolish universal healthcare, so that you had to buy private medical insurance. The percentage of health coverage dropped from 100% to about 12%, because you have to do it out of your own pocket income. As incomes rose, that percentage rose up a bit, but not much above 20. And this is the period when, if I always look at India and China's gap, I mean, India does relatively little, but it doesn't have sharp changes. So one result of it is that China had about 14 years lead over India in terms of life expectancy. In this period, it dropped half to 6 or 7 years. Not because India was doing anything frightfully good, but the Chinese were messing things up by thinking that what works very well for agriculture will work similarly well for medicine, which it didn't. And I'm quite privileged to chair the International Advisory Board of Peking University's Development Institute, so I often go there. And I remember being frustrated at trying to speak to the Chinese on that, and they was coming pretty much to deaf ears through them. But by the beginning, after about 2000, you begin to see a kind of recognition that the Chinese themselves, nothing to do with my advocacy or anybody else's, but they were beginning to see that something had gone wrong. The Chinese have moved from mid-30s life expectancy to 68 in a period of bad economic performance, and with the most spectacular economic performance in the following 25 years, when it was income per head was tripled or quadrupled. Their life expectancy moved from 68 to 71 years. And that is the time when, again, a change came. But it's a change, unlike in a democracy in India, where you have to carry the entire, you have to get the opposition parties, you have to get everyone with you. It had the effect of basically when about 6 people were convinced, they changed the policy. And the coverage started going up in 2004. My latest estimate is that Lancet did the coverage of about, I think, 82% about earlier this year. I think it's probably more like 85 or close to 90% actually now. So they're cured, but you can see both the things, that things could move very fast and yet could be very fragile if the understanding changes. And suddenly it could be all washed out, as it was in 79, as it was in 1960, 61. So I think that's what we have to look at. The social determinants of health include, and for me, I hope because democracy is valuable for so many other reasons, is to include um, um, a, a political engagement of a much wider kind than we have succeeded in having in India. It's changing somewhat. Gender inequality, I don't think they get enough credit. I think the feminist movement have succeeded in bringing gender more into public focus in a way that it wasn't. When I first started work on in the 1960s in Delhi University, several of my colleagues told me that it was an eccentricity on my part. And one of them told me, was very kind to me, she said, it's an amiable eccentricity. But I don't think anyone would take that view today. So I think that's changed, but it needs to change a lot more. And it's much easier to emphasize certain things like, dowry-related violence and so on, because these are newspaper stories. On the other hand, quiet hunger, underdeveloped kids, underweight babies, maternal undernourishment, high maternal mortality, not so easy to publicize. So I think this is the enormous area of social engagement that social determinants of health also bring out. Now, I do want time for discussion, and I think I should wind up in a couple of minutes. I had one or two other things to say, but I think I've said enough to generate, I hope, some controversy. Um, I just want to mention that one thing that's gone wrong, in my judgment, in the United States in particular, is an understanding of what is it that the market does, and why is the market economy important. I take the view, I've always taken the view, the market economy is very important. And I remember I visited Brazil recently, and I was told that they had asked me often earlier, and I did go once or twice, but in Latin America. But I think there was first basically the anti-world order thing was very, very anti-market, which in a way I think is a mistake. And then, of course, it turned kind of really murderous, as in Chile, at the time of Pinochet, and football field after football field of people being shot down, because there's no tolerance of that. But Latin America has moved. There's more democracy, more understanding of the role of the market. Brazil has done dramatically well. As, by the way, has Bangladesh quite a bit. Bangladesh's economic growth rate is way lower than India's. India's about been at least 7. This is low this year, 7. High was 9, and it may come back to that. Bangladesh has been quite a bit less than that. On the other hand, nearly every one of the human development indicators, Bangladesh has overtaken India. And I think that has been possible because of social engagement, in which if I had more time, I could have discussed the greater, more active role of women in Bangladesh had made an enormous difference to that. And of course, the government also has a role. I mean, in India, you see now India's, the public resources in the hands of the government, because of high growth rate, is about 4 times in real terms after correcting for inflation than it was 20 years ago. So the question is how much is committed. It's not just the government. The government recently introduced, it has been often very slow, but even when it does it, like an employment guarantee program or food subsidy program, there's an enormous opposition because the vocality of the middle class in India is enormous. And it's a large middle class, about 200 million or so. And, they have there's nothing wrong with that. They produce great poetry, great films, great theater, great music, great art, and so on. And yet there are other 800 or 900 million people there. So I think the whole issue, I think the 2 central issues in my judgment, in addition to all the one, and I want to emphasize all the ones that this conference is bringing out in social commitment, to bring out the issue that the role of the media is extraordinarily important in public discussion and informed public discussion. And I think there is a real lesson in the way the information system has collapsed on the medical understanding in this country. And there is a similar problem elsewhere. And I think when I was in Brazil, I was looking at how these changes take place, as it happened even in the previous government of Cardoso. He's regarded in Brazil as right wing. In America, would be regarded as extreme left wing, I think. But then, of course, under Lula, there was a much greater thing that was being led by public discussion on that. This is really very important. It's important in India, important in China, if it wants to have a more stable less vulnerable system, and it's important in the United States. But there is a further thing to understand, and that's what I was going to end on. What is the role of the market? I'm pro-market because the market generates good income for people, and it also generates income in the hands of the government to do those things that the government has to do, and the private system cannot. Healthcare, we have known since the work of Kenneth Arrow in 1973, cannot be as easily delivered on a private basis because of asymmetry of information, which is, I don't think there's any economist worth his salt would deny the importance of the asymmetry of information in healthcare, so that the idea that the market could deliver it is, I think, foundationally wrong. But there's also the question about certain things which are duties of the government, and the market economy still you want prosperity of because it increases the role it increases the opportunity of the government to do things, provided through social commitment and social agitation we make it possible and viable for the government to do it rather than having to face opposition. And it's not a new idea. In 1776, when Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, published The Wealth of Nations, he made it crystal clear why is it that a good market economy is important. And I wish people who have become so greatly enamored with Smith would stop reading only 3 pages of Wealth of Nations and look at the rest of the book. And here I quote from Smith, and with that I will end. Smith says, why is it, what is the task of the political economy? Why do we want a good political economy? And in this he included a good understanding of how the market works. It is, says Smith, the pursuit of 2 distinct objects. I'm quoting from Smith. First, to provide a plentiful revenue of subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue of subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services, unquote. That's Smith. And so the idea that the market is somehow hostile to public services is a very modern idea, and it has done untold harm, I think. Well, not untold, told harm, but a lot of harm. And I think we have to, my plea would be, let's concentrate on all the things that's in the conference, but also recognize that health is a quintessentially a social subject. Even we cannot salute each other without bringing health into the story. It invades it. It's present in every aspect of our life. And there is room even for economics and for politics in pursuing the reach and relevance of the social determinants of health. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.